Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everybody who might be out there. It's been a while since I've done a real talk with Vince, and I thought at this particular stage, as Voice of Freedom and the FBN network have been gracious enough to be allowed to go into the farmers' fight back in Victoria at Manoo, that I might just do a little bit of a pre-lib before that, just so that people know what's going on. So what's actually happening, of course, is that Victoria are looking to put a massive amount of construction through various farmers' fields and paddocks with wires and towers and everything else. And the actual network is like this, just to give you a bit of a picture on how far they're looking to actually extend things over that particular area of the state. And of course, there's associated costs within that as well. And those costs, basically, according to VNI for the whole thing, is going to be about $7.9 billion worth of towers and bits and pieces. But it should also be understood that that $7.9 billion is not the full cost of running this network, because it's going to leave out things like operating and maintenance expenses, land acquisition, the development and partner costs. Now, interesting, partner costs. What partner costs? Financing. So obviously there's going to be interest on top of that, risk allowances and escalation that is going to be happening this current Saturday at Manoo. So the eventual financial costs will obviously be much, much higher than the 7.9 billion. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. We know what the costs are there, but I had a little bit of a thought experiment. I thought, just how much does it cost in materials to build these wind turbines, these solars, and what would be the comparison to do the same thing with a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant? So I spent time there. I thought, okay, so let's just do a practical cost, material costs only. And the costs I'm going to show you are material as best estimate. They're not guaranteed prices, but it's just the material costs. So that means the costs of the steel, the costs of the concrete, the costs of the plastic, the glass, whatever, not including any labor, not including any actual building of it, just the pure costs of producing those particular areas for wind, solar, nuclear, and coal. So I went down my little thought experiment. I thought, okay, so what would it cost if I was going to do a terawatt of power from a nuclear station, a wind station, a wind farm, and a solar farm? So I went and had a little bit of a chat in GTP, and this is what we come up with. So just the costs alone, remember, and through this little experiment, there's a couple of assumptions that I need to let you know. Firstly, we're not taking into account the cost of inflation or any of that sort of stuff. And we're also going to assume that the power that's used by Victoria is the same amount of power that's now and in 100 years' time. So everything is just worked on today's figures only. And of course, we know those figures won't necessarily exist, which is why I come back up to this one. Sorry, that was me. I should have been on there. So my bad. I'm just getting my tiles worked out here. So a nuclear to just the cost for the materials for a 1 gigawatt installation of nuclear is around 292 million bucks. For coal, around 250 million bucks. For wind, $522 million. For solar, 2.1 billion. I went, okay, well, yeah, I sort of understand that. But really, 1 gigawatt, What's that going to give us? Well, effectively, a 1 gigawatt running at 100% capacity, now we have to understand that none of these things, no matter what we do, like a nuclear power station is never going to run at 100% capacity. So we're going to work in a 90% capacity. So that 1 gigawatt installation will supply about 7.8 gigawatts or hours, or around about 788 terawatt hours over a year. The same with coal, the same with wind, and the same with solar. But notice the capacity factors. Capacity factors 90, 80%, 37% for wind, and 20% for solar. I went, okay, so if we've got to take in the capacity factors and we want to deliver a gigawatt of power, that means that at 37%, doesn't solar have to be bigger? And doesn't wind have to be bigger? And then I thought to myself, well, hang on. How much power does Victoria actually use? Guess what the answer is? 45 terawatt hours every year. So that means effectively my 1 gigawatt power station, which is only going to produce about 7 terawatts, is not going to cut the cake, is it? So, okay, then I'm going to have to obviously supply enough stations to do that. So the next part of the experiment on the rabbit hole here, okay, so to generate 45,000 gigawatts of power per year, I'm going to need 5.7 gigawatts of power from nuclear power stations. I'm going to need 6.4 from coal. And you notice it says I'm going to need 13.9 gigawatts from wind and 25.7 from solar. Yeah, what? Oh, right. That's because they don't produce as much, because the wind's not always blowing and the solar's not always there for the sun, because we have night when it's dark. So they don't produce what they're going to be. Now, the interesting part about this, of course, you can expand nuclear and coal in their stations purely by adding extra generation and maybe increasing the footprint a little bit bigger of the station. Or you could go and put complete individual stations up, and the same for coal. But with wind and solar, that's a different thing. To expand them, you literally have to take up a lot more space to keep expanding them and making them bigger. So therefore, the actual installation cost is much closer to the mark than it would be if you were going to double up the nuclear or the coal. So another way of actually expressing that is if we were to assume that nuclear equals 1, so if we have enough power plants to do 1 nuclear, like 5.7 becomes 1, then to do the same for coal, we need 1.2 times as many power plants. To do for wind, we actually need 2.43 times as many plants. So in other words, that's 2.43 times as much space. For solar, it's 4.5, which is very, very interesting. Or if you want to look at it in a nice graphical format, that's what it looks like, right? With nuclear at 90, coal at 80, wind at 37, and hiding behind me there is solar at 20%. So approximate gigawatt generation to supply Victoria with 45,000 gigawatts of power, gigawatt hours of power. So I have to be correct in that particular statement. So to supply Victoria, that's sort of the feed that we'd be looking at. Now, what are the costs involved in all of that? So now we start going, okay, so if we've got to generate this type of power, what sort of costs have we got? Well, let's look at it. So at nuclear, per installation, and this is assuming that we built a individual 1 gigawatt power installation for each site. Then what we have, of course, is for 5.71 gigawatts is the amount that we would have to generate. It's going to cost us about 1.67 billion. For coal, it's going to cost us around about 250 million per station, which is 6.42, because we've got to allow for it's only going to run at 80% capacity. That's 1.6 billion. Wind at 522 million. It's going to have a total supposed capacity, remembering that it only runs at about 37%, is 13.8 gigawatts of power, and that's 7.25 billion. And solar, which only averages out at 20% over a year, is 2.1 billion, and that's 25.68 gigawatts of supposed power out there. Because remember, you're only going to get 20% of that on average over the year is 54 billion. So my brain's going, wow. Now, that's very, very interesting. That's a lot of money. And this is, remember, this is not including transmission line costs or anything else. This is just to build materials for those stations. That's not including labor, not including anything else. And also remember that the main coal stations and nuclear stations can sit pretty close to already established lines. So you don't actually have to build a whole network infrastructure that's not really required. I thought, oh man, okay, that's a fairly decent amount of money. And then I had another thought. And my thought was, this has to be replaced. I wonder how often it has to be replaced. Well, that was the next thought question I went down. And here it is. For nuclear, 80 years. For coal, every 60 years. Typical life cycle for wind, 25. For solar, 20. And I went, okay, that's going to have an interesting effect. So what happens if we wish to replace all of this, and let's take it over a 100-year lifespan? So that was the next set of figures I started working out. Now, remember that these figures are not 100% guaranteed, but they give you a fairly good idea of what's going to go on. So how many times are we going to have to replace the nuclear power plants? Now, in this situation, I am saying it is a full replacement, not just an upgrade to an existing one, but a full replacement of everything. Because in some areas like wind, for instance, I believe a full replacement is what is required, because you can no longer use the same grounding mounts that previous wind towers used, etc., and so on. So we kept that consistent across the board. So here's our figures. For nuclear, over 100 years, we're going to spend 3.34 billion. Now, I said we because it's the taxpayers' money, okay? Because pretty much guaranteed we'll be putting it out somewhere in this, right? No matter which companies are involved or buying, you know, they're going to make their money out of it, and we're going to end up paying some of that cost somewhere, somehow. So for coal, 3.2 billion. For wind, 29 billion. And for solar replacements over a 100-year period, $216 billion. One has to ask the question, why? For a more visual representation? That's it. Just let that sink in. See how much money is going out for green energy. And they say it's going to be cheap. Well, nuclear looks cheap. Coal looks cheap. Right? Rebuilding solar certainly bloody doesn't. So, very interesting. Now, remember that this is not taking into account that we're staying with only 45 terawatts of power. Victoria's not going to grow. It's not going to need more power. This is just using 45 terawatts of power, terawatt hours of power every year. So what happens if it happens to need 200 watts of terawatt hours, 200 terawatt hours every year? Then these costs are going to go exponential. That's absolutely unbelievable. Once you start going down this rabbit hole and start looking, you go, what the hell? Anyway, carrying on. The one thing we didn't talk about was batteries, because we have battery storage. Now, what sort of battery storage is Victoria looking at? Something around about 3 or 6.3 gigawatt hours, I believe, is what they recommended. It was very hard to find out any information about that. But just to give you an idea, if something was to happen to Victoria like it happened in South Australia, where the whole state went blank because some power lines went down, those battery backup systems, if you have a 10 gigawatt hour battery backup, you're only looking at about 1 hour of power. 20, 2 hours, 100, 10 hours, 250, 25.4 hours, 500, 2.1 days. That's actually pretty good. And that's using their average 5.14 or a main load of around about 9.8 gigawatts in peak load. So I think that's pretty good. That's not bad at all. So the next big question, right? Assuming the life cycles we have, we know that nuclear needs to be replaced twice. Wind has to be replaced coal twice. Wind replaced every 4 times out of that 100 years. Solar PVs replaced every 4 years, 4 times every 100 years. And lithium battery, working on an average lithium battery only lasting 15 years, it might sneak to 20, it might not, but let's say it's 15. That is 7 times the replacement. Okay, well, then I wonder how much the batteries costs. Let's have a look. So this is just assuming materials. This is not installation costs. This is not connection costs. This is nothing else, right? That gives you an idea on how much we would spend in replacement batteries over a 100-year period. 3.43 billion at the 10 gigawatt level. But if we want to have a couple of days up our sleeve, $171.5 billion in batteries. Now, I ask you this question. If we look at the material costs, and remember that none of this incorporates any transmission lines, any towers, any buying of land, none of that. This is purely material costs. Which of all of those items do you think is cheap? Which one do you think is going to supply a consistent amount of power? Right? Which one of those items is not going to cost us a fortune to keep going in the next 100 years? Which one of those items do you think is going to be easily expandable? And furthermore, what is the footprint of the state used to expand those items? So with that, people, I thought I might just leave you with that and think, well, there's a rabbit hole, a little journey I went down over the last couple of days just to see what the real cost of electricity might be, materially only. So with that, people, we will see you all hopefully at Manoo with hopefully a live stream for Voice of Freedom and FBN networks. If all goes well, if we're not able to live stream out of there, we certainly will be recording and hopefully catching up with a few people for interviews and bits and pieces. So from me, it's cheers. I hope you enjoyed that little trip down a investigative lane.